Morning, everybody. So in this video, we'll talk about sliding pay scale at Crete, and we'll talk about load selection, and then we'll also talk about how some of the other carriers like Schneider and Landstar does it, for example, and then spot market too. So we'll touch on a little bit of all of that. Now, I'm not an expert on some of these other carriers, so if we can get some feedback from drivers at those companies or on the spot market, that would be great and helpful to everyone. So at Crete, we'll talk about what I do know very well is at Crete Carrier Corporation, they use a sliding pay scale. Um, not everybody uses a sliding pay scale, but Crete does. And what it is shorter miles pay more, shorter loads pay more than longer loads. I mean, that's the gist of it. And you're like, why would a shorter load pay more than a longer load? Well, a shorter load could be in a highly congested area, like say, for example, from Chicago to Milwaukee. Well, you're going to find a lot of traffic, and you're going to do probably a drop and hook on both ends, so you're you're gonna waste more time um, fooling around with picking up and dropping a load and dealing with a customer than you are going to be behind the wheel. Now, on a longer load, like say 800 miles, that may cover you for a day and a half, or maybe in some cases 2 days, and you're not going to deal with the customers that much. So you're going to get much more miles, much more drive time. So your earning potential is great, is good. So we look at how much money you're going to earn on a short load versus how much money you're going to earn on a longer load. So shorter loads pay more. Otherwise, drivers would decline that load. They would be like, no, I don't want that load. It doesn't pay anything. So they got to pay a little bit more for a shorter load than they would for a longer load. Make sense? So what Crete typically does, and when they're dispatching, they will send a driver at least three loads. It'll be like, here's three options to choose from, and the driver has a choice. It's like, okay, well, let me look at each of one of these loads individually and see which one fits me the best, and then they choose a load. Now, in some cases, you don't like any of those three, so you just ask for three more, and they'll send you three more. It's like, okay, but they're not going to send you 20 loads to look at. Now, like at Schneider, for example, they use a load board, and you can pick your loads yourself as a driver, whatever load you want. You just pick that load. And at Landstar, you have to negotiate for that load. Landstar is kind of like double brokered load. So, from what I understand, talking to Landstar drivers, I could be wrong, but this is what I understand how they do it is Landstar negotiates the loads with a broker and then negotiates that same load with the drivers. So in some ways, Landstar is double brokering. They brokered it with the broker and then they broker it with the driver. So the driver, in many cases, probably could have got a better rate if he went directly to the broker, but they use Landstar as the middleman. But then Landstar gives them discounts and stuff like that, like any other big box carrier. So, they make it work somehow, some way. Um, if you were on the spot market, you would look at loads and you would negotiate or bid on a load, and you would compete with hundreds or thousands of other drivers. So every option has its pros and cons, and it's up to you as the owner operator to decide what fits you best. What do you like best? So what works for me doesn't work for the guy at Landstar. You don't like it. Or what they have at Schneider doesn't work for me because I don't like it. But there are differences, and it could be the difference between whether you join one carrier over another, or why you would go on the spot market versus going with a big box carrier. So it all depends on how it fits your needs. I like the sliding pay scale personally. Um, there are advantages to sliding pay scale. I get paid for deadhead miles, but it at other locations like Landstar, you don't get paid for deadhead miles. Deadhead miles is you're got an empty trailer, and you got to go pick up your load. You don't get paid for deadhead miles if you're on the spot market, and that could affect whether you take a load or not. So let's say you're in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you got to go pick up a load from Des Moines, Iowa, and it's deadhead miles. Well, at Crete, you would get paid those deadhead miles. You're not going to get paid as much as you were loaded, but you'll get paid, close to $1 per mile, you know, to go pick up that load. Well, if you're on a spot market, you're not getting paid any of that. You're that's out of your own pocket. And I think that's the same way at Landstar. Now, I don't know about Schneider, but it could be at Schneider too. Um, and so you get paid deadhead miles at Crete. Now, let's say a lot of times the drivers that get paid the most at other carriers and on the spot market will want to pick up loads that are in heavily congested, populated areas. So think of the Northeast region, from Boston, Massachusetts, all the way down to Washington D.C. Highly congested, and the rates are better there, no doubt. But guess what? Fuel prices are higher too, and you're gonna fight a lot of congestion, But they'll be getting higher rates. Well, if you're in a sliding pay scale, you probably want to avoid those areas because you're going to get paid the same for a 400-mile trip, whether it's from Lincoln, Nebraska to Dallas, Texas. It's going to pay the same as if you were driving from Boston, Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. It's going to, if the miles are the length of the journey is the same, the sliding pay scale is going to pay the same. So as an owner operator, you'd be like, well, if I'm going to get paid the same for those many miles, why would I want to drive in all the highly congested areas? That's one of the reasons why I rarely ever go up to Boston, Massachusetts, or anywhere on the eastern seaboard. Same thing with the West Coast, LA to San Francisco. It's like those rates are higher on the spot market, but if you're in a sliding pay scale, it's like, well, I don't get paid any extra to drive through California, and their fuel prices are higher, and you can only go 55 miles per hour. And it's like, I'd rather avoid California. So for me, what works best for me is kind of like the mid-south region. And this is an ideal place to operate your truck because it's mostly flat terrain. The fuel prices are low, fuel taxes are low. It's mostly wide open, so you can get your truck up to a higher speed, get more miles for the day. There's less traffic, and you're going to get paid on sliding pay scale. You're going to get paid as much in that region as anywhere else. So these are things you have to think about as an owner operator because you're running a business. Don't think you're necessarily tied to any one particular carrier because in and of itself you are your own small business. You're self-employed. And you got to think what's best for my small business. It's like, well, there's less wear and tear on the truck if I stay in this, mid-south region, and I get paid just as good here as I would anywhere else. So you got to think about that. And a lot of times owner operators will look at the weight of the load. Obviously a lighter load, you'll get better miles per gallon. Now you got to pay for your own fuel. So. You get a little bit picky about these loads, It's like, well, I'd rather haul that Frito load that weighs 10,000 pounds than haul that dog food load that weighs 45,000 pounds, and it's like you can get an extra mile per gallon, on a lighter load. But that's, you have to think about that, and you also have to think about the weather because sometimes that light load can really come back to bite you. There's times when you got that light load, 10,000 pounds, and then you got a 40-mile-an-hour wind. Well, that didn't do you any good because now you're parked. So that wind might take an entire day or 2 days before it comes out, and you can't go because you're too light. So you got to think about these things. There's a lot of strategy involved. What loads are you going to take? This is a big part of the game. Being an owner operator is like you're trying to figure out, of all your load options, what's the most profitable. It's like, well, I can make more miles per gallon, but let's take a look at the weather, because now if there's a lot of wind gusts, like you're going from Dallas to Phoenix, but you got to go through you got to go through El Paso, and up through New Mexico, well, there could be huge wind conditions. So you want to know that before you choose that load. Sometimes you'll take a heavy load. If there's bad weather, like a winter storm, um, and there's a lot, snow on the road and ice, stuff like that. Sometimes that heavy load is good for you because it'll give you more traction. It's like, yeah, I'm not going to get as much miles per gallon, but guess what? I'll be able to haul 500 miles today because I got a nice heavy load based on the weather conditions and road conditions. There's times when I'll pick up a beer load from Coors at Golden, Colorado, and I'll take it to Lincoln, Nebraska, or I'll take it all the way to Milwaukee. Um, it's heavy load, max load. Your gross weight is close to 80,000 pounds, and you're like, why would you take that load? And I'll tell you this, I'll get 8 miles per gallon because the continental shelf is on a downward angle from Golden, Colorado, all the way towards the center of the United States. So for like 700 miles, you're going downhill, a slight downhill. And even though you're at max weight, you'll get good fuel mileage. So it doesn't bother me at all to take that load. I like that load, so you get to know the loads, you get to know the terrain, and this will help you choose, which loads are profitable, which loads are not. If the company says, hey, here's a load of bottled water that's very, very heavy, and we want you to take it from Cheyenne up all the way up to Portland, Oregon. It's like, oh no, I'm not taking that load. Are you crazy? You got to cross the Rocky Mountains. You're going to be climbing those mountains with maximum weight. You're going to be getting 6.5 miles per gallon, and you're going to get all that wear and tear on your tractor. You climbing those mountains, that's you're putting that engine under a lot of strain. And then when you're coming down that mountain, you got your full jake brake, and then you're using your brakes yourself, and you're putting a lot of wear and tear on those brakes and drums and shoe pads. And it's like, well, taking that load is not such a good idea because you're gonna wear out your truck faster. You're gonna end up being in the repair shop more often. You keep hauling them heavy loads through the mountains. So this is where you got to think for your, what's in your own best interest as a small business owner. It's not just about how much money you're making per mile. It's also about taking care of your equipment. It's like, well, that's a lot of wear and tear, and I would really not want to take that load. Now, you can go that same route if you're hauling a load of potato chips. And you're like, oh yeah, I'll do that. That's fun. Because you're flying up those mountains. While the other trucks are climbing at 20 miles per hour. You got that load of potato chips, and you're cruising right 65 miles an hour up that mountain. You're passing everybody. So those loads you would take. But those heavy loads you want to try to avoid. And sometimes what happens is that you take a light load and you're like, oh, that was great, but then your next load is heavy. That happens sometimes, because it's just it always seems to work. You can't get the sweet spot of back to back light loads. Every once in a while you're gonna get a heavy load and you're like, and that may be the only load available in that area. So then you'll have the choice of, do you want that load or you want to wait? You're like, well, I'll wait. Okay, well, you may be waiting 2 days for a better load. In that case, you might be like, well, I'll take that load, even though it's a heavy load. I don't really want it, but it'll take me somewhere else where there'll be a good load, and then it'll work out. A lot of times you gotta play for the averages. It's like you can't get a light load every single load. You're like, for the week, how did you do? Did you get 3,000 miles for the week? Did you get 10,000 miles for the month? Did you get 120,000 miles for the year? So one load isn't the end of the world. It's like, don't call up your dispatcher and have a absolute fit because you got a heavy load. That's ridiculous. Everyone has a heavy load. Everyone gets a load that they don't want, but on average, you know, you look at it that way, it's like, well, that's a good week. I had one or two heavy loads, but other than that, it was a pretty good week. That's how you got to look at it. So load selection is a very big part of being an owner operator. A lot of times if you'll talk to other owner operators and guys on the spot market, they'll be like, well, I'm in, I cooked this load from point A to point B because it was paying, 250 a mile or $3 per mile. But now I'm here, I can't get another load that pays anything. It's like I got a deadhead 600 miles and they don't get paid. Or they'll be in the middle of nowhere in the spot market and they'll take a load that pays less, just to get to a better market. They're like, well, I'm out here in, Fort Dodge, Iowa, and I need to get back to civilization, so they'll take a low paying load, rather than deadhead, so you'll see that. But again, they're playing the averages. They're looking at, what's their average pay for the week or the month or the year. One load here, one load there ain't going to make that big of a deal. So you got to think about, what other carriers have to offer. Load boards sound great. Spot market sounds great until you realize that in order to make any money, you got to spend most of your time near the big cities. You got to spend it on the West Coast or you got to spend it on the East Coast. And it's like, you know what? I don't really enjoy that. It's like, well, maybe you would be better off working at someplace like Crete or another carrier that uses a sliding pay scale, and you could drive anywhere you want because the miles are going to pay according to the length of the trip, not the geographical location. So these are things that you have to strategize about. You have to think about. When you choose your load, you're like, okay, how's this going to affect my profitability? If I choose this load, what are the weather conditions like? Am I going to be able to get 500 miles for a day? Other things that you want to think about is if you get too picky about load selection, then you're going to hurt your own productivity. So let's say if you just take what's offered, you could probably easily get 3,000 miles for the week. You may even get closer to 3,500 miles per week. But if you're picky and choosy about what loads you're going to take, you only might get 2,800 miles for the week or 2,500 miles per week. Why is that? Because no load was good enough for you. You were too damn picky. So you got to think about that productivity, and at Crete, they have a discretionary bonus, a quarterly bonus. They call it a safety and productivity bonus. And if you hit 30,000 miles for the quarter, you get a bonus. It's not guaranteed, but it's if they are doing well and they are offering the bonus, then you would qualify the bonus as long as you didn't have any safety violations, no accidents or anything like that, no speeding tickets. You can get an extra 4 cents per mile, up to another 4 cents per mile. This is totally discretionary. They can change the rules on that anytime they want. They can not offer the bonus. They can offer the bonus. They can say, well, it's 2 cents per mile. They can say it's 4 cents per mile. So in that way, it covers, the bonus covers a lot of, lot of things you may not like about the load selection. It's like, well, I'll go ahead and take that heavy load, even though it's not as profitable, but it'll help me reach my bonus for the quarter. So you got to think about that too. So if you only want the best loads, and you're going to take less miles, well, guess what? You probably aren't going to You're not going to have enough qualifying miles for that quarterly bonus. You're going to miss out on 4 cents per mile. So did it do you any good to be all that picky? No. So it's quite quite interesting as an owner operator to pick and choose your loads and try to maximize gross revenue, profitability, miles per gallon, manage weather conditions, and things like that. It's challenging. It's very challenging. Other things you got to think about with load selection is where you want to get your maintenance done. It's like, well, if you get your maintenance done, say a Freightliner in the Midwest, you can get in and out probably in a day or two. But if you've got all your loads in the Northeast or on the West Coast, and you go to Freightliner for maintenance, you could be there for a week, 2 weeks waiting. There's a line, so you got to think about the productivity of all that stuff. It's like, well, I'll take this load out in the middle of nowhere because there's a Detroit Diesel certified mechanic. There's a shop out there that I like, and they did great service. They gave me the national 1 year warranty, and I'm in and out in a day. So I'll take that crappy load because I want to go see that great mechanic. So you got to think about stuff like that too. So yeah, I know guys who are being routed different places because they have a favorite restaurant somewhere. It's like I want to go there. I want to get me some barbecued ribs. That's good. Or something like that. So there's a lot of reasons why guys choose some loads over other loads. It's not always about the money. It could be a wide variety of things. Maybe it's closer to their house. They can have a 34-hour reset at home before they get back on the road and finish that load. So there's a lot that goes into that. But I will say there's, to wrap things up, there's variation on types of uh, loads that are available to you as a small business owner. From one carrier to another carrier to another carrier. No two carriers does it alike, and that's good. It's good. There's competition. Competition's good. Um, the more choices are available to you as a small business owner, the better you're going to be able to manage your business. What works great for me may not work so good for the guy at Schneider, and vice versa, or the guy at Landstar, or the guy on the spot market. So you gotta find out what works best for you. And guys will swear up and down, oh, you can't, you can't make any more money. Spot market's supposed to be. And it's like, oh, okay, until the market crashes. The spot market's not the way to be. It's like the rates go up and rates go down. Then they'll say, well, Landstar's the place to be. Then a lot of owner operators flock to Landstar, and it's like, there may be too many drivers per load available. It's like, well, maybe Landstar's not the place to be. Well, it's all going on the load board at Schneider, and it's like, God, you can't get a decent load, because you go to pick up your load and you figure out someone else has already got the load. They beat you to the load, and it's like, well, maybe that drop and hook sliding pay scale at Crete ain't so bad because, it's steady. It's very steady, and 80% of the loads are drop and hook. It's not live load. You got to think about them live loads, live unloads. How many times have you gone to the shipper receiver and you're ready to pick up your load and you're like, yeah, what's your phone number? Oh, yeah, go park out back. We'll call you when we're ready. And like a day and a half later, that's not productive. Well, that might have gave you a great rate per mile, but you sat for 8 hours waiting to get loaded. That didn't do you no good. So you got to think about all those things when you're trying to decide as a small business owner which big box carrier you want to be leased on to, or do you want to be on spot market? And you got to think about all those things, all those little details. All that stuff costs you money. It's either making you money or costing you money. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.